Matt Borden is the Assistant Commissioner of Government and External Affairs for the Department of Social Services at the DSS. He oversees the DHS Intergovernmental Unit, which includes a team of 5 borough directors, a director of community engagement, and a director of special events. He is responsible for community engagement for all shelter openings in New York City, and he's responsible for maintaining the community relations and troubleshooting for all sites in the DHS portfolio. So he's got his hands full.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Sean. I appreciate it, and it's a great honor to be here tonight. Just a little bit about myself. Before I took this role, I was Chief of Staff for Assemblymember Deborah Glick, who's a little bit further south down here for a while, and then prior to that, I actually was a New York City public school teacher. And my family is generations of public school teachers in New York City. So I got involved in this issue because it's something that's near and dear to my heart. When I was actually a teacher, taught 5th grade, I actually had some homeless students who were living in shelter and going to school at the same time. And I saw what their life was like and how hard that was for them and how amazing they were under the circumstances that, to no fault of their own, they were able to thrive under really challenging circumstances. So, I took this job, and it's been a great opportunity. And I think where we are now as a city is in a really interesting place because for about 20 years there was sort of no homeless plan at all in New York City. It was completely reactionary, reactive. It was sort of very willy-nilly. And earlier this, and we actually saw a huge increase of that population. So I'll say from the beginning, when Mayor Bloomberg came into office, the number of homeless individuals in New York City was 31,000, and then by the time that when he left office, it was about 51,000. And the last 3 years, between 2011 and 2014, we actually saw increases of about 5,000 individuals a year going up. So it became a really pronounced issue. And when we're looking at what our system is looking like, a lot of folks I know think about street homelessness as sort of as the main issue that comes to mind when we talk about homelessness in New York. But actually the number one individuals within our system are families with children. So 70% of all homeless New Yorkers are families with children. We actually have more homeless New Yorkers that are ages from 0 to 6 than all single men in the city. So it's an issue that really affects families. It affects women and children primarily. Of those families, about 90% are female-led households. And it's something where the drivers of the homelessness issue in New York City are nothing that's so surprising, right? It's evictions, it's discord in families where you'll have families that'll be doubled up, and then there'll be someone else will be a new birth, or someone else will come to the picture, and there's no longer any space for them. And we also see domestic violence as a driver of homelessness as well. So earlier this year, in February, the mayor announced a plan called Turning the Tide to actually figure out how to stem the issue and really get a hold of the crisis. And that plan was really as follows. It consisted of closing more than 360 shelter locations across the city, shrinking our footprint by about 45%, opening up high-quality shelters with really robust services to help people like the individual that you were just talking about. It's not really helpful to just put somebody into a shelter and not give them the actual social services that they need to get back on their feet. So we're trying to sort of change the paradigm what that looks like. And then finally, it was really having a borough-based plan. So right now, there'll be children in our system who are from the Bronx, but they're living in a shelter in Brooklyn. And they're having to do this long school commute. So we're trying to figure out how can we kind of do a more borough-based system to keep families closer to where they're from, closer to their networks of supports, closer to their churches, closer to their families and relatives. And as we do that, it's really about looking at how do we also at the same time, increase the stock of affordable housing in New York City, and that's not our area. That's other parts of the city. But it's an important fact to know that between 1994 And I think about 2014, more than 150,000 rent-stabilized apartments were lost in New York City. And so it's hard to not look at what this crisis is, not look at seeing the sort of rising rents happening across the city, looking at the lack of affordable housing, and not realize that we are facing a situation where we now have about roughly 60,000 individuals who are in the system. We've also, though, while we've been in trying to figure out how to create shelters, we've also done two things that I think are really smart. The first is we increased by tenfold the amount of money that we pay towards legal aid and housing court attorneys. And we actually have seen, so that number has jumped from spending $6 million a year on that to $62 million a year. And within the first year of doing that, we actually saw a decrease of by 24% of evictions across the city. So it's sort of like that ounce of prevention goes a long way. And then the other aspect, of course, is figuring out once people are in the system, how do we move them out? We've actually moved out in the past few years more than 65,000 individuals who are in shelter into housing. Now, look at the numbers that we have. So basically, it's every night there are basically about 120 families that show up in the Bronx without a place to go, and it's our job and our legal mandate to house them. So it's an incredibly challenging situation. It's one that we're firmly committed to. It's one that we really want to figure out how to do a better job of talking about. And that's why I was really happy when John sent that invitation. I know you all have talked a lot about To Breaking Ground and our amazing street outreach teams, but I did want to kind of provide a bigger picture on the kind of work that we're doing. And I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that folks have, or if folks think of a question later, John has my information. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions offline as well. So I don't know that number off the top of my head. It definitely is more expensive to put up a family in a hotel than it is to actually put them in a permanent housing situation. That was another thing that actually drove homelessness, was that there actually was there was a program called Advantage, which was pretty successful. It actually coincidentally ended in 2011. So that's actually it was smart. It was paying people who are in shelter. It was basically giving them vouchers and subsidies to remain housed. The program ended, both the state and the city ended it in 2011, and as soon as it ended, not surprisingly, we saw a ton of people come back into the system. Now, to your point, it's much cheaper to actually be able to house people, even if you're doing a subsidy program, to pay them to live in apartments than it is to pay for shelter or pay for hotels. So we reinstated that program, added to it, expanded it, in terms of trying to move people out. I mean, we're opening up a drop-in center on 14th Street between 6th and 7th Avenue, and we definitely are always trying to figure out how we can open up, because we think that obviously having places where people can come in and get services is really the best way to do it. And so we're certainly happy to figure out how to open more of them, because we think it makes sense. I think it's really challenging. I mean, my job, I get to travel all across New York City and talk to folks just like yourselves in different places. And I think that there's so much fear around people who are homeless, and so many people have biases against people that are homeless. Again, just when you were talking about the gentleman, I think that there's a real easy way that we can dehumanize people. And it's not intentional, but I just think that you can be on the train. If you see somebody that is mentally ill, it can be really quick to sort of write them off as a person in your mind and kind of create a story in your head. And I think when you talk to people and find out that they're far more complicated, and the situation that led them to this point is far more interesting than you would have imagined, it's just really important. And I think that we need to do a better job of humanizing our fellow New Yorkers in a sense. And I think, and then be able to figure out how can we get the services to people that they need. Yeah. So I think so.
How many people are not in the system that you would like to bring into the system?
So we estimate there's about 3,500 and 4,500 street homeless individuals. Right. So those are the folks that we'd like to see come in off the street. And obviously, as this weather happens now, the officers know, in terms of certainly when we have code blue, that's when the temperature drops below 32 degrees. Becomes a little bit more urgent, because then it could be a serious health risk. But it's also very hard. New York City has very stringent laws about who you can remove from the street. So the first is why there are homeless people in some places, not homeless people in other places. Well, I think that to answer that question, I think you're talking about what are the transportation options available. I mean, I think part of the reason that Midtown has always sort of had a street homeless population, of course, is because of the Port Authority, because of their various different transportation, subway options.
Panhandling as well.
And exactly, and where are the tourists? And I think that panhandling, and now we're doing some panhandling studies right now, because obviously, as you know, as savvy New Yorkers know, a lot of panhandlers aren't actually homeless, and it's just a way that they can earn a pretty decent living. So when there are a lot of tourists, and this is obviously robust, and tourists give money, that's going to attract more people that are going to be there. If there are also other services that folks are receiving, I mean that also can draw people to neighborhoods as well. In terms of what you're talking about, who are in our shelters and how that intake system works. So when folks are homeless, they go for an intake and they go in for an assessment. And so if you're talking about, you know, if you're exhibiting signs of mental health issues, or you're having chemical dependency, there are specific shelters that folks go to. If you're talking when we're talking about using commercial hotels, and we really are trying to be thoughtful of who are those individuals who are staying in those hotels, and you know, a third of our families are actually employed, right? So actually, a third of the folks who are in our system are actually have jobs. They just can't afford rent. So we're really thoughtful about that, and there's also curfews for our shelters as well. So for families with children, that's a 9 p.m. curfew. So if you're on the street with a hotel, in you know, our families are after 9 o'clock. That's not an issue, and folks are back up. I think there's a lot of fear around it. I actually live next to a shelter. I'm married, and I didn't even realize that there was a shelter there. It's something that's just been sort of on the block for a really long time. I didn't know. I just feel like New York City. You just like see. You're like that's just there. And then someone told me it was a shelter, and then actually I got this job. I was like, oh wow, I had no idea. And I think that happens all the time. I mean, part of the issue is that the supportive housing that we had from the state has not kept pace. We were able to, throughout the 90s, there was able to create a lot of supportive housing. What you're exactly talking about. We've been waiting on the governor to do more on that aspect of it. Thanks, guys.